This has to be the explanation as to why the gold to silver ratio is so high. It's not that the market is flooded with silver. On the contrary, there is a continuing physical deficit of silver. The only thing that changed in this market is that it's lost its ability to control the price, that it has become insensitive to the price. And therefore, I argue that it lends itself to manipulations. You can think about it as a man whose hands are tied behind his back. And you punch him in the face, he's unable to fight back. This is how I see the silver market right now. It is unable to fight back.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in today. I do appreciate it. As odd as it may seem, in ancient times, there was essentially an internationally recognized currency, and that currency was the two metals, gold and silver. This led to many people all over the world keeping an eye on the gold to silver ratio. If you're not familiar with it, it measures how many ounces of silver it takes to equal 1 ounce of gold. In ancient times, the gold to silver ratio, or GSR, was much lower than it is today, which leads many people to ask the question, why is the gold to silver ratio so high today at around 100 to 1? And why is silver so inexpensive when compared to gold in 2025? What do you think is going on with the gold to silver ratio today?
Well, first we need to say that a gold to silver ratio of 100 or more is a very rare event, and it only happened a handful of times during the 20th century. For instance, during World War II, and again in 1991 during the first Gulf War, and then in 2020. And now we're seeing it, I think, for the fourth time. And if we look even further back in history, I think we will be amazed to discover that this type of gold to silver ratio is even more rare than we can imagine. If we look back in history, we can see that a gold to silver ratio of above 20 is a phenomenon which started in the late 19th century.
It was basically non-existent in the distant past. I mean, it was 12 to 1 in China in the 1600s. When David was the king of Israel in 1000, it was 12 to 1. It was 12 to 1 throughout a lot of the Roman Empire. So this is highly unusual.
Yes. If you look throughout history, it fluctuated around 15 to 1, which is the same as the ratio between the average concentration of these two metals in the Earth's crust. So it makes sense that this will also be the ratio between their prices. And throughout history, this was about the ratio. Sometimes it was lower or sometimes it was a bit higher, but it never went above 20. And if you look at the historic chart, it's like a flat line throughout history. And then, it goes haywire during the 20th century. So,
Wham. Yeah.
yeah, so we can't help but ask ourselves why, like what happened in the 20th century to explain such a dramatic shift in the gold to silver ratio. Now, when I look at the chart, I immediately notice that the ratio started drifting upward around the time that human beings discovered fossil fuels, discovered oil, and invented internal combustion engines, or in other words, it started inventing modern machinery which allowed human beings to mine more efficiently. The two events happened so closely together that there has to be a
It
connection
seems
between the two. It's too much of a coincidence. So I'm assuming when I try to explain this very high gold to silver ratio, it's somehow it
okay.
has to do with fossil fuels.
That makes sense because there is that time period that lines up.
Yes, but then again, you could wonder, hey, modern machinery made both gold mining and silver mining more efficient. So why should it affect the price ratio between these two metals? The only thing which modern machinery is able to do is as though bring production forward. For instance, if there was a deposit which would take you 100 years to mine with manual labor, so now you're able to mine it, let's say, within 10 years with the use of modern machinery and with the use of fossil fuels. But again, it doesn't explain why the price ratio between the two metals should change so dramatically. So I had this theory that perhaps modern machinery affected the mining of silver more than it did to gold, as though we're extracting silver faster than we are extracting gold. And this way, we're creating a temporary abundance of silver in the market compared to gold.
I mean, and that theory makes sense because the ratio in the ground hasn't changed. They're mining this finite resource. They're just mining it faster, creating that much excess silver. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this was my theory that as though we have artificially created this, abundance of silver in the market, again, compared to gold, and that for a time it artificially suppressed the price of silver. And this is why the gold to silver ratio is so high. But it would end once we deplete all the deposits, and then ore grades begin to fall. And then, as though we will revert back to the original ratio. I mean, like that was the theory. There's just one problem with that. And the problem with the theory is that the data does not support it.
Yeah, so the data isn't matching up.
I started checking what was the amount of gold and silver which was mined before the invention, of the internal combustion engine and the discovery of oil, and comparing it to how much we extract today. And to my surprise, since the year 1900, the mine supply of gold has increased tenfold from 370 tons per year in 1900 to about 3,700 today in 2024. That's about a tenfold increase. Well, at the same time, the mine production of silver has increased by only fivefold from about 5,400 tons in 1900 to 25,600 tons today in 2024. So,
So gold mining has gone up 10 times, silver mining has gone up 5 times, and yet the gold to silver ratio is about 100 to 1. So that doesn't make sense.
yes, I had to discard that theory. The theory fell through because the data does not support the theory. And as a good scientist, when the data does not match the theory, you have to go look for a better theory.
Absolutely.
I can say with confidence that the current gold to silver ratio is not the result of mines flooding the market with silver, with excess silver, as though depressing its price. It's not supported by the data.
Yeah, so this isn't a normal supply and demand scenario where there's excess supply and the price is getting pushed down. So
Yes.
there's something else going on here.
Yes, there's definitely something else going on there. You can also see that the problem is not with the demand, because, in the past 4 years, we've had a physical deficit in silver. So there's no lack of demand to explain the low prices.
No, absolutely. There's massive demand right now. We've been in a physical deficit for years, and today they use silver in phones, computers, electric cars, solar panels. So that there's multiple industries that are going to need silver going forward, and that demand is likely going to increase over time based on projections right now. So there's definitely no lack of demand. There's a high level of demand.
Yes. So, in search for a better answer, I started looking at the geology of gold and silver. and trying to see if if I could find an answer there. Now, it's interesting that, gold is an inert metal. It doesn't form compounds with other elements. So when you find gold in the ground, it's pretty rare, but when you find it, it's usually in its native form and in relatively concentrated veins.
That's interesting. And whereas compared to silver, silver will be found with other metals.
Yes. Now, silver is an entirely different story. Silver does tend to create compounds with other elements. Silver is what we call, that's a professional term. It's called a chalcophile element, which means that it tends to bind with sulfur.
Okay.
And when it binds with sulfur, it creates a mineral called argentite. Now, we're all familiar with argentite because it is, the tarnish that you get on your silver,
It
that
comes from
black
that.
stuff. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
that's it. That's the same element. It's a silver sulfide. It's a compound of silver with sulfur, turns the silver black. And when it happens on your coins and bars, it happens due to tiny amounts of sulfur that exists in the air or on your fingers.
Interesting. I don't really prefer that, so I'm not a big fan of Argentite,
Me neither.
if I
I
said that
like
right.
I like my yeah, I like my silver clean and shiny.
I
But
do as well.
yeah, but in nature, silver does tend to bind with sulfur. And how are silver deposits created? Well, it tends to be carried up from the depths of the ground by what we call hydrothermal fluids. And it rises up through cracks and faults in the Earth's crust, and it accumulates near the surface this way. Now, sometimes these deposits are rich in silver, but that's pretty rare. Usually, the silver rises from the depths of the ground with other chalcophile elements, which means with other metals which tend to bind with sulfur, which are copper, lead, and zinc. And almost everyone who's a bit associated or has any knowledge of the mining industry knows that silver tends to appear either together with copper or together with lead and zinc. And the reason why you have these types of deposits, well, it has to do with the temperature in which they were created and the amount of oxygen which was present at the time. So when you have a higher temperature and a lower amount of oxygen, you get a copper deposit, which contains, very small amounts of silver, trace amounts of silver. And on the other hand, you could have deposits which contain lead and zinc with a bit more silver. In that case, the concentration of silver is a little higher, and this is created when the temperature is a bit lower and there's more oxygen. So you have these two types of deposits which are common.
Okay, so lead and zinc, it's a little higher the concentration than it is with copper, but it sounds like it's still pretty low,
Yes, in
all
both
things
cases,
considered.
yes, in both cases, usually most deposits contain small amounts of silver. Now, in the past, in the days in which mining silver required manual labor, these deposits were uneconomical to mine. But with the advent of fossil fuels, suddenly they became profitable.
So back in the day, they pretty much had to find a vein of silver that guys could go in with pickaxes and get after the silver directly. But nowadays, with the advent of modern machinery, they're able to go after these mixed deposits a lot more effectively. And so, for the silver that's coming to market right now, how much of it is coming as a byproduct from the mining of copper, lead, and zinc?
Okay,
Is it
that's
over 50%?
Yes, that's the interesting thing. Over 50% of all the silver mined today comes from those base metal mines, And this is the revolution that happened during the 20th century. Silver used to be just like gold. It used to be that you went out to look specifically for silver. But suddenly, as of the beginning of the 20th century, silver started coming to the market as a byproduct of the mining of other metals. And so the market changed. The market as though changed. The market became insensitive to the price. Now, that's a term from economics. It means that no matter if the price of silver goes up or goes down, the supply of silver from these mines will pretty much continue as it is because it is only a small fraction of their cost benefit analysis. And so they don't have any like pricing power. They don't get to set the price of silver. They'll sell the silver no matter what happens because it's just a small fraction of their total revenue. And so long as there's demand for those base metals, they will continue producing the silver, as an afterthought.
Right, because they're going after the other metal as that's their bread and butter. That's their real moneymaker anyway. So even if they're not pulling silver up, they're going to keep mining for that other base metal. And then so all the silver is just extra for them to sell and bring to market.
Yes, and this led me to the conclusion that this has to be the explanation as to why the gold to silver ratio is so high. It's not that the market is flooded with silver. On the contrary, there's, I wouldn't say a shortage of silver yet, but there's certainly a deficit, a continuing physical deficit of silver. The only thing that changed in this market is that it's lost its ability to control the price, that it has become, insensitive to the price. And therefore, I argue that it lends itself to manipulations. I compare this market, you can think about it as a man whose hands are tied behind his back. And you punch him in the face, he's unable to fight back. This is how I see the silver market right now. It is unable to fight back. What do I mean by fighting back? In a normal commodity, if you decrease the price below the cost of production, then the supply would fall very rapidly. And then, even if there is a manipulation in the market, it won't be able to last because there will be a physical shortage, which will force the price higher. But with silver, it's just not there. It's not happening because financial institutions are as though relying on the fact that the flow of silver more or less will continue, even if the price falls and is abnormally low.
Right. They feel like it's just going to keep coming to market anyway. And for the time being, the market has been able to deal with it. After going through all of these, potential things that seem like maybe they could line up the advent of machinery. Well, it turns out it's not that. Well, is it because there's more silver coming onto the market? No, that's not what's going on. And the demand is increasing. So really, you're not left with any options. Market manipulation is what makes the most sense. And it is something that we know happens, at least from time to time, for sure. But a lot of us, myself included, suspect that it happens on a regular basis. Uh,
Now, what's interesting to note that, if the GSR started rising in the late 19th century, this suggests that what we call, the manipulation in the price of silver, it started a lot earlier than we imagine. That it actually started, to a certain degree back in the late 19th century.
Based on the charts, that would make sense. It seems like it's probably been going on for a very long time.
Now, perhaps it wasn't to the same degree, perhaps it wasn't so actively being manipulated. But if the explanation is manipulation and it started at the beginning of the 20th century, then you had some kind of a manipulation starting even back then. And then you're reminded of what is called the Coinage Act of 1873, in which there was an attempt to demonetize silver, which is also called the crime of 1873.
Yeah, so this was the end of the Coinage Act of 1792, where they had described $1 as 0.773 ounces of silver. And then that was the end of it in 1873, or the crime of 1873.
So you have to ask yourself if the attempts to switch from silver to gold were not just the beginning of what we're seeing today. And this realization that silver is ripe for manipulation, it was known even back then.
Absolutely. You know, they would have been aware that it was not what was considered to be a dollar anymore. And it makes sense that, some criminally minded person, even way back then, might have started thinking, hey, how can I take advantage of this?
Yes. Now, I want to end, on a positive note because this market structure, it's a double-edged sword. Because just as the supply of silver, the mine supply of silver remains constant when the price is too low, it's likely to remain the same when the price goes up. If the price starts running, the mine supply of silver will not be able to adjust accordingly in order to meet the rising investment demand. And, this brings us back to
Right.
the idea of a silver squeeze.
Right, absolutely. I mean, some of the veins they're aware of that are like underwater, the price will just plain old have to be significantly higher than it is today. Well over $100. And let's say it climbs up into like, I don't know, the 50s or 60s, and there is a primary silver mine that they could reopen. It's going to take time for them to do that. They're not going to be able to do this really quickly. And so the price could move really quick if there's a lot of pressure from investors.
The silver mining industry has some flexibility, but it's very small. And when it comes to, those base metal mines, those copper, lead, and zinc mines, they won't care too much about the rising price of silver. I mean, like if between 5 and 15% of their revenue comes from silver. So if its price doubles, so perhaps it's going to climb to 10 to 30% of their revenue. But in most cases, it's not going to translate into a like this, dramatic increase in revenue that is worth operating the mine on a larger scale, increasing operations in order to produce more silver. In most cases, it's just going to be insignificant.
That makes sense.
So we could reach this position in which the price enters this, self-amplifying loop in which the price of silver rises, it attracts more investment demand, but supply is unable to increase accordingly, and it only leads to a higher price and more investment demand. It's self-amplifying loop.
Right, absolutely. Because the
And this
supply
is
is
this is
relatively
exactly
inelastic.
what people mean when they say that silver can go to the moon. It means that it's either not moving at all, as it is right now, or it goes to the moon. There's no in between. That's the thing.
Right, absolutely. And it is definitely set up to move. And the only way it's going is going to be up. I mean, maybe down a little bit, but it could significantly increase in price.
Now, the thing is about human beings, I want to say, human beings, they're not like equipped to deal with such a price movement. They're most comfortable when the price is rising gradually, in a line, it just goes up slowly. And then they have the time to think about it, to invest. And this is what most people like to see. But with
It
silver, the transition between not moving at all and going to the moon is going to be so rapid that there's not going to be any time to react. That's the thing. You see what I mean?
yeah, it will move so quick. And the market is small. There's not a whole lot of investment grade silver out there. So it could get out of control really quick.
That's the problem we have with convincing people to invest in silver. It's because they don't see the price moving. They want to see the price moving before they put some money into silver. They want this confirmation from the market, from the price, that they're doing the right thing, and they're not getting it, and this is why they're not invested in silver. But they're not going to get that confirmation. It's never going to come, because the moment it takes off, it's going to just go to the moon so quickly, there's not going to be time to react. So when it comes to silver, you have to take a leap of faith. You're either in or you're out. You're either on the rocket or not. And when it takes off, it's simply going to be too late to do anything about it. Thank you for listening to the Silver Hermit podcast. If you like this content, please donate in the link which appears in the description below. Please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I release a new video. Remember, I'm not a licensed financial advisor. This video is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as investment advice. Before taking any investment decision, please consult with a professional financial advisor who may assess your personal investment objectives and needs.